Pronto. Welcome to all alumni and friends of the University of Auckland, wherever you may be in our slightly strange and challenging world at the moment. This is the fourth in our series of inspiring talks, Raising the Bar, Auckland Home Edition. My name is Mark Bentley. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and Development, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you on board. Now, Raising the Bar has been a fun-filled mainstay of the university calendar for the last 3 years, and we've very much enjoyed taking 20 great university speakers into 10 Auckland bars to give interesting talks on one very special night. Sadly, level one came too late for us to reorganize our bar-based adventures, but it has given us the impetus to bring Raising the Bar online so we can share it with a local and a global audience. So you're very much welcome. This series has 6 great speakers over 6 weeks, and so far we've traversed engineering, health, and justice. Tonight, the spotlight swings onto, today, this morning, wherever you are, the spotlight swings onto the business school, and in particular, Professor Darl Kolb. So pour yourself a drink, relax, and let's get the show on the road. And making sure that the show stays on the road tonight is your MC, Associate Professor Michael Lee. Now, Mike's job is to introduce Darl more fully and to help you ask your burning questions later on. But let me give you a couple of quick points about Mike to start with. Mike is the director of the International Center for Anti-Consumption Research, which certainly seems ironic for an associate professor of marketing in a business school, but there you go. Now, that might be surprising, but more surprising is before setting out on a career in academia, Mike spent a year working as a professional wrestler in the US. Violent, challenging, painful, often dangerous, but that's enough about Mike's marketing students. Let me hand you over to the man himself.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. Yes, academia is certainly easier than getting slammed around in your underwear. I'd like to welcome everyone to Raising the Bar, but before I introduce Darl, I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So during and throughout this seminar, please submit any questions you have for Darl. We'll be monitoring these as we go along, and we'll try to answer as many as we can later on. As you know, as we are all familiar with Zoom now, you can upvote any of those questions you like, and then we'll obviously tackle those at the very top of the list first. So moving on to Darl, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend and my fellow Westie, Professor Darl Kolb. Darl is a pioneering theorist on social and technical connectivity and the first professor of connectivity in the world. He's published on connectivity in organization studies and organizational dynamics, and he's editing a special issue on connectivity in and around organizations, which hopefully, due to COVID, will still be out in 2020. Darl is also a visiting fellow at the University of Sydney and the University of Cambridge. He's currently interested in metaphors for a digital age, and that certainly is part of what he will be talking about today. And if any of this whets your appetite, please feel free to check out and even contribute data to his project website called Metaphors in Use. That's metaphorsinuse.com, but he'll talk a little bit more about that during his presentation. So without further ado, let's hand over to you, Darl.
Great, thanks, Mike. And welcome everyone, wherever you are, whether you're raising a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or something in between. It's certainly great to see you here. I was thinking about the other first time I gave a Raising the Bar talk. I must admit it was very challenging, daunting, in fact, going into a bar. And actually, what they didn't tell me was that half the audience had signed up to be there and were totally tuned into the talk, and half the audience were just random diners. And I spent the entire talk trying to engage the far side of the restaurant, which was at the end, it was, I felt like I got a few of them hooked in, but I presume you're all here wanting to hear a little bit about this topic. But if I'm in, I will try not to interrupt your breakfast or dinner. Yes, I am a professor of connectivity, and in the past I've given talks on connectivity, but also working with robots and the future of work. Often those topics become a bit depressing because people think they're going to lose their jobs, and guess what? Maybe we're still back there for completely different reasons. And again, who would have thought a couple years ago that we'd be reaching out to you around the world because we couldn't literally go into bars? let's start talking about metaphor. Now, you might wonder why a business academic cares about metaphor. And let me get my little clicker here. I mean, metaphors are all around us, and they're taken for granted in common everyday language. And to some extent, we probably don't see them much anymore. We're so used to using figurative speech. But you might think that they don't have a lot of use in organizational theory. However, when you start thinking about what the power of metaphor is it allows us to understand a fairly complex phenomena, whatever that might be, through a term or an illustration that's very clear and crisp in our minds. And so it helps our understanding of phenomena, and especially new phenomena. We often, consciously or unconsciously, we start to come up with metaphor to help our understanding of them. Some other recent scholars in communication studies have said that, don't mistake metaphors as just the icing or something frivolous. When we're talking about human phenomena, metaphors actually in language are the cake, not just the icing on top of it. So another misspent youth, actually I wrestled in high school, believe it or not, but I also had a 10-year career as an Outward Bound instructor. And Outward Bound, for those of you who are familiar with it, is one giant metaphor. I mean, the point of Outward Bound is not to make you a rock climber or to make you more able to run a kayak down a rapid. Those physical and mental challenges are there really to give you a parallel experience, a challenging and a unique one, but a parallel experience for you to understand other elements of your life. So basically, it is a metaphor provided to you that you project yourself into and then get self-understanding. And that's me on Denali a long time ago in North America. Now, metaphors in organization studies are not new, and probably the one that we're all most familiar with is organizations as cultures. We probably don't think of this much as a metaphor anymore because, frankly, we just talk about cultures of organizations as a very powerful and totally acceptable way to understand them. We join cultures that fit with us. We idolize amazing organizational cultures. But really that thinking only came to us in the 80s. Before that, we didn't really think of organizations as cultures, but it came on board and we now use it routinely when we think of organizations. Also in the 80s, a guy named Gareth Morgan came up with 8 different metaphors for organization. And in the 90s, when I was teaching undergrads at the first year, and believe it or not, we used this book, Images of Organization. Now, it's a very dense book and kind of tougher than most textbooks. But the students loved it in the sense that it gave them a whole other perspective. And you'll see the familiar ones there, organizations as machines, as organisms that grow and develop. Of course, culture, organizations as brains that have knowledge and share knowledge and process information. But the students always like the ones of psychic prisons and instruments of domination. And in fact, organizations can contain us, lock us down, if you will, in terms of limiting our options or dominating our lives or dominating markets, as we actually do see nowadays. So that was one take on it. And more recently, well, beginning in the 90s and through the early part of this century, when I was teaching MBAs, I used a book by Bowman and Deal called Reframing Organizations. And especially the executive students I was teaching, they found it quite powerful to take the experience they had in organizations and look at it through different lenses. So they would see, of course, the structural, the box and bubble, understanding the rational view of organization, but then they look at organizations as human resources, that organizations need us, but as much as we need them, and that they're there to serve humans as much as we're there to serve them. And of course, the symbolic frame, which included cultural elements, but all the symbolism that goes on in organizations. And finally, the political lens, that if we see organizations as political systems, as Gareth Morgan mentioned too, we understand that they're not really just rational places. They're places where we have to persuade, we have to align scarce resources, we have to, there's an element of conflict and back and forth all the time. And by getting these different views of something, we get different understandings that we don't have to trade one for the other, but we have multiple ways to understand the same phenomena, which is quite powerful in a managerial sense. One of those symbolic elements is viewing organizations as theater, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but one of the classic examples was, and research was done on Disney. At Disney, you're not just an employee, you're actually a member of the cast. And whether you're sweeping the streets or selling hot dogs or one of the Disney characters, you are on performance and you're performing that role to the highest ability every day. And for those of you who've been to Disney event centers, venues, you realize they do pull that off largely and very consistently because they use that metaphor. We're on stage and we're performing. Very recently, I had the privilege of stopping by one of the tech campuses in Silicon Valley, and this is Facebook. This is their classic campus. Now they have a massive other campus too. But the classic campus just looks like it's performing. It's Main Street America or Main Street Silicon Valley with free food down the street, the various little bits of the company all assembled and people wandering around much as if they were in some sort of idyllic setting. Coincidentally, this campus was actually designed by the same people who designed Disney World. So there you go. So finally, in the organizational space, when I started thinking and writing about connectivity a few years ago, I actually even suggested that it was not yet a theory. There's no general theory of connectivity, although we, of course, keep working away on elements of theory. But I described it as a metaphor and tried to look at it in that way, that it's borrowed a little bit from the technical world of connecting routers and data to how we now use it in a social sense of connecting one another. So that's kind of the brief history of metaphor in organization studies. And finally, in my teaching, for also a long time now, some of you might be my former students, you know I've used a simulation called Mike's Bikes. It's a business simulation. It's quite intense. It's sort of the outward bound of business school projects. It gets people over their head quite quickly. And to set up my students, whether they were undergraduates originally and now in the business master's program, I use the metaphor of a small boy going into a woods with his dog, and it draws on Jungian psychology, this notion of leaving the familiarity of the village and going inside the darkened woods and to see what we can discover. And in this woods, this young boy discovers a real challenge, and I won't tell you what it is, but it's a significant challenge. And importantly, in the story, he doesn't run away. He confronts the challenge and carries on and realizes this is the place where I will learn. And it's funny because over the years, I mean, I tell lots of stories in class, and I try to make sense of this simulation through lots of business school lenses. But the story of the little boy has often resonated with my students very well because they understand when they're in an uncertain territory and that things are hard, they realize that, well, maybe I can make sense of this as this parable, this story, and the metaphor helps them kind of get through a tough situation. So with that in mind, more recently, I was starting to wonder, well, if metaphors still basically make sense to my students, wouldn't it be interesting to know what their metaphors are for the digital age that they've grown up in? Most of my master's students now, as you might imagine, are digital natives. They range in age, but more or less they've grown up with a lot of digital technology. And all of them, of course, are on their smartphones these days. So I started only a year or so ago thinking about that and asking my students about this. So that was kind of the genesis of the idea, which eventually became the website and which we'll be referring to today. And of course, in the meantime, the world has changed. I was on sabbatical earlier this year. I got home just before the lockdown, safely and fine. But I realized, of course, what was going on around us was truly unique. And what I decided to do was to look at how this grand experiment on work was maybe at the first stages, how are we making sense of this? So that was my intriguing, curious question. And believe me, I don't think any of us in our academic careers would ever expect to get the entire world participating in an experiment, which we effectively are, a grand social experiment. So with that in mind, I added a second tab to my website. So there's a digital life tab if you're, you don't have to be a digital native, because a lot of us immigrated to digital life. So that's a set of questions around what you think of technologies. But I added the working from home tab onto the site and trying to understand what how people were making sense of their experiences. So these are initial findings, and so we're still gathering data, as Mike mentioned. But I want to just present these to you to prompt some ideas and some thinking about this experience, which is largely shared. I assume many of you have had some changes to your work and life balance and work and life. So we get this kind of duality where on one hand, things are good and then they're also not so good. So we look at the technology as being a bit like me, a bit worn down, working well, but also crashing. And fatigue, physical, mental fatigue has been one of the common anecdotal complaints. And I imagine by now, and certainly in New Zealand, as we come out of the more restrictive lockdowns, we'll see this balanced out with more diversity of activity, etc. But in the first couple of weeks, people's complaint was not so much that they didn't understand Zoom, but they were being zoomed out, or they were being teamed out, or whatever the platform you're using. So there's this kind of burden on our brains to deal with it. And of course, the other factor is that even though technology is largely stable and amazing, we can find that it does fail. And I myself, Mike and I live near Tehanga, Bethel's Beach, and we have, okay, not the fastest broadband in the world anyway. And last week we were off the internet for 3 days. That's a long time in internet time. And so when things fail, you really struggle to get back back up to speed. And so we do find that even though it's pretty good, it can drop off and be a problem. And so again, it can be our savior, but it can also be a devil also in terms of its persistence of technology. Working when my partner is around, some of us have a great experience. We get the cup of coffee, we get the fire and dinner made. For some, it's not that great, but for some of us, it brings back together the elements of our life. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but the integration of life and work has been going on for a long time now. This is not anything new, but it will have certainly ramped up the evolution. And for some of us, that's a very positive evolution. For some, maybe not as much. The other factor is that it's like living in a television studio with your best friend. And so I imagine a lot of us have made time for this presentation or being a part of this in light of what others are doing around us. And we'll talk again about this television studio element. And one participant thought that every day seemed the same. I mean, perhaps going to the office, you always have a little more variability with traffic and what happens in and around the office. But somehow or other, getting up and getting in the same clothes every day, maybe just kind of going through a very common routine, feels a little bit like Groundhog Day for those of you who know the film reference. Now, of course, monitoring and surveillance is one job of managers. And in this case, participants sees the supervision, virtual supervision, a bit different, like Big Brother-ish. And that might be because the supervisor, our boss, literally shows up in our bedroom or in our laundry or our study. as opposed to in the more neutral space of an office. But they're there all the time, maybe. You get to see their head popping into all kinds of meetings. And this person had the reflexivity to say, well, actually, since I'm a manager, I wonder how my staff think about me, which is probably a whole other conversation. And in a business school, I'm sure we'll come up to that issue of how are we as managers, not just participants in video meetings and conferences, how are we managing in these virtual spaces? And of course, there's kids. Kids in the background, kids in the foreground, kids all around. Pets also feature highly. And this is an interesting take that some of us will share, that there's a great element of intimacy that's quite nice. And sometimes I've been interviewing people lately, and you know, they'll have their young child there and right on their lap or right next to them, and it just adds another dimension of their presence. But at times you're trying to manage noise and distraction too. So that's not surprising, I'm sure. So generally, some of the images that came from folks like yourself, working from home is like a cocoon. It's, you know, again, individualistic, but in this case, safe and cozy, and allows us to grow and progress maybe. It's like being in the wilderness, devoid of people, but with high-tech tools. So we got all these tools now, just don't have anyone to lean over our shoulder and ask how they work, or don't have any as many human distractions. It's mostly us and our tools in some of these home environments. It's also can be a bit like being siloed, and I suppose this is where organizations that are less functional or helping across functions. But I would imagine most of us are dealing with the possibility of dealing with our immediate team, our immediate department or group, and maybe not reaching out across the organization. However, by contrast, in my own experience, we've had town meetings with the University of Auckland staff that are thousands of people, which has never actually happened in physical settings. So by contrast, you can also reach beyond the silo. I also thought this was interesting. It's like eating sugar-free brownies. It has its advantages, but a little less satisfying. So again, people often say they're getting a lot of work done at home, but possibly it doesn't have the full feel of what they consider their normal job or their job in another setting. And work at home, again, has this contrasting. For some, it's a dream. It's living the dream, to be able to do what you like from where you live and where you like to be. For some is the perfect scenario. And for others, it's a little bit different. It's being cooped up. You don't have everything you really want to have. And there are limitations to it, even though it doesn't kill us, but it limits our ability to be who we want to be. So those were the metaphors we've got so far. And I want to just think about some of the possible issues that do come up from what we've experienced, and welcome your questions. First of all, we can realize, as we've known for a long, long time, that when a technology comes along, not to be deterministic, but technologies do affect other move around. And so technology used for business, for example, Zoom, has moved over to Zoom drinks and Zoom family gatherings. And it has a nice gee whiz factor. And we realized that actually, well, this affords us something we hadn't thought about. So they're transferring and expanding of a technology across social settings. Also, you might think about changes that you've done during lockdown that might actually make good sense when you get back at the office. So some of my colleagues have morning check-ins on Zoom, but in actual fact, we know that a lot of good, and scrums, for example, or the agile technologies are all about checking in. And so that might be something we do, even though we didn't do it prior to the lockdowns. And also, when you go back to be conscious of what did you miss and why did you miss it? And could you run better meetings, or could you make the things that you normally do a bit better, given your experience? And what would you really want to spend time and energy on when you're back in the office environment? Also, you might think about what would have been like if your organization had just said, right, next week you're working from home, that's it, everyone. What would have, as a thought experiment, would that have worked out? And probably not, or there might have been some resistance. And resistance from whom? Would it have been you personally? Would it have been certain divisions? Would have been middle managers who are often caught trying to translate such a grand plan into practice? But it's just more of an interesting thought experiment. But again, it's given us an unusual experiment to be able to do this so radically, so widely. And again, what would you change in your organization now that you're going back? And I've already heard organizations, large organizations in New Zealand, that are proposing that they use a modified homework balance, homework approach. So people might come in 3 days a week and then have 2 days at home, etc. And so this is an opportunity that I'm sure a lot of us might be thinking about as we go forward. Now, the other thing to think about going back to Disney and performing in theater is, has work become more of a performance? I mean, we understand the power of first impressions, and we understand how important our nonverbal communication is in the workplace. But I think it's heightened our awareness about how we look and perform and present ourselves, at least in the virtual medium that we're working in. But it might also change our visibility behaviors in other ways. And at the office, there are communication scholars who already talk about visibility behaviors, and they talk about sharing spreadsheets and what's visible on servers, etc. But I think we'll start to see that our visibility in and out around the organization might also be modified based on this. How does it even change when we get back to the office? For example, I've also heard that sometimes people don't go to meetings now face-to-face already. This is pre-Zoom. Just on large campuses or in multi-story buildings, they would go to meetings on Zoom or on virtual platforms, Teams or whatever, anyway, because they didn't want to spend the time and effort walking across campus or up and down the elevators. Well, one other thing to think about is we've set this out as if there's home and then there's the office. But sociologists have known for a long time that there's this notion of a third place. It's the place that's not quite work and it's not quite home. For many of us, that might be a cafe, it might be the gym, it might be a meditation space or a church. It's the place that it might be a train, it might be a commuting space. We've known about this for a long time, and Starbucks co-opted this in the late 90s in terms of their setting. And basically, they invited us to spend time at Starbucks as the third place, the place between other places. And now that we hear the plea for us to come back to bars and cafes, the point there really is not so much to go, well, it is of course to support the cafe, but it's this need for this other space in our working lives. And I think that's worth paying attention to. Ultimately, the lessons are reminders that we are social to the core, that some of us could work in isolation forever and prefer to work independently, very self-contained. It's not just the introverts, but many of us have known for years, those of us who worked at home over the years know that we can get a lot done that way. But we also want the energy, the ideas, the inspiration of being around others. And we have friendships there. And so we also know that we will have a pent-up demand for those social affordances again. And of course, with so much connectivity in our lives heightened by the lockdown, we understand this paradox that we've perhaps been never more connected, but perhaps at more and more risk of also being disconnected. And these are large social issues, but issues that organizations do have to also consider and deal with to some extent. And finally, one of the things we've learned, colleagues and I who studied distributed work teams years ago, we thought that we would come up with a team score for connectivity, if you will, and that team aggregate or average connectivity would be a factor on their performance and other things. It turns out after years of study, the one thing we learned from the team study is that it's an individual thing. That the connectivity experience or the isolation experience, the media experience is very much in the eyes of the beholder. It's an individual level phenomena. So whether it's emails and how much email time, how many emails you received, it varies by individuals. For Mike, it might be X, and for Mark, it might be 2 or 3X that they're comfortable with, and too little or too much is very much an individual thing. So we know that about email. We'll also understand that now about virtual platforms and virtual media experiences. It will vary by the individual, and something that organizations and teams will have to factor in. So that's what we know so far. It's early days in this work, and obviously this will kind of grow and develop as we understand more. But I'm happy now to take comments, questions, and whatever. Thank you.
Right. So I was just waiting for my signal there. Thanks very much for that. There we go. Thanks very much for that, Darl. It was really interesting to hear about your perspectives on metaphor, the importance of metaphors in organization, also on connectivity. I'm noticing a few audience questions, but I'm sure many people were listening to you and are probably thinking of more now. So before we go to the audience questions, I have a few of my own just to get the ball rolling and to give buy some time for those people wanting to type in their questions into the Q&A section of Zoom. When you were talking about that work and home integration, I was thinking that, you know, obviously, as you said, the blurring between home and work has been happening for a long time. And I guess it really started to ramp up since we, you know, got the phone firstly, and then we had laptops, which we could then take much of our work home. And now we have our smartphones. So many of us probably wake up and the first thing we do is check our emails or do some work-related task before we even hop out of bed. And now with COVID, this work-life integration or blurring has become more complete than ever. So while work-life integration is only possible with connectivity, it can also be a massive burden. And I think you touched on that a little bit. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the importance of disconnectivity.
Well, yeah, Mike, you're right. And again, to reiterate, this is a ramping up acceleration of a trend that's been going on for a long time. And again, there are scholars who work just on new ways of work, it's sometimes called, or this in this integration. And you notice we don't even talk about work life as separate elements anymore. It's more that work and life are being unified or integrated. But the point you raise is, I would also agree that as much as we are becoming more integrated, the need for disconnection is just that much greater. And how we do it, like the phenomenon of how much is enough, will be very individualistic, very individual. But, you know, in the last couple summers, we've heard of people taking digital holidays. And I think we now accept that if someone is offline for a couple days, they really mean it. They're not just, you know, they're not just teasing us. They actually might be really not watching their email, really taking a break. And that will suit some people. For others, and for children, we realize, of course, it's very important to reduce screen time at least before bedtime. And so we're learning, kind of like eating habits or drinking habits, we're learning there are fundamental principles about use of screens and again, to promote healthy sort of sleeping patterns, etc. So yeah, I think the trap that we've gone, the thing about working the lockdown was that it was so easy to say, it was hard to say no because people knew you couldn't go anywhere. They knew that if you were on Zoom this morning, you could be on Zoom this afternoon or something. So in a way, we didn't even have the usual thing of going out of our office and wandering down the street or whatever. And so our absence was less excusable in a way, but we have to be able to be absent, if you will, from the connected world. And that again comes back to how we manage that visibility and accessibility. But I would encourage people to think maybe about this extreme example, to say, gosh, if I had to do another month of this, it would kill me. What would I have to change? And then maybe think about some of the behaviors that you could change to keep your normal work-life integration going or improve it even.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess a related question is, you showed the that sociological triangle between the work, the home, and that third place. And I guess what the last couple of months in lockdown and remote working has taught a lot of us is, what happens? What would the sociologists think of that triangle of the third place and the workplace and the home collapsing into just one space, which we've seen? What are your thoughts on that, Darl?
Well, yeah, that would be a very radical, different way of viewing our lives too, when there's sort of, just the one place. And almost goes back to more traditional societies where, I grew up on a farm, and farmers don't leave the farmhouse to go to the farm office. Well, actually some might, but very few. Mostly they just leave the house and go out and start working. And it is really on one place. So I think that if you think of some of us work in that, and shopkeepers, et cetera, might work in that fashion. But for a lot of us, going to an office is a separation that's welcome or at least routine. And again, that commute to town or whatever is a way for us to change gears. And if we gave all that up and just became based at home, that we would see this integration happening in a very different level. And by the way, this isn't generational, because again, being around as you are around our younger generation, they also recognize the need to disconnect. It's not just folks like me who struggle with this or think about it. It really is a human condition about how we can kind of keep at least some separation and some pushback to it. But yeah, it's a whole new challenge. The other factor is that a lot of people with the forthcoming economic times might be moving in back home with parents or consolidating households. So not only is there one place, but it's a different social place than the idealized nuclear family. And that too would change things possibly. So yeah.
Yeah, so many interesting things to think about. Okay, one more question, then we'll head over to the Q&A session from the audience. Now, this is slightly different. Obviously, some of the work you've been talking about near the end of your presentation was about, moving into this sort of 3-day work day where you're in the work and then 2 days at home. And I see some of the questions from the audience is heading that way as well. Now, when I think about the social experiment that you speak of, what would have happened if the university said, all right, we're moving to a remote tertiary education now, there would have been a huge amount of resistance. And I suspect many organizations struggle with this. And is it because, the lack of social cohesion, and when people work from home, they're often, before COVID, it was seen as there may have been a perception that if someone works from home too often, they're either less committed or unreliable. So what are your thoughts on this importance of workplace presence, or this performance, as you put it?
There's a whole notion of absenteeism, and again, what we symbolize by not being at work, etc. Yeah, I think the big wake-up call for the world is for those of us who've worked at home at least some of the time over the years. We would understand that you can get not just work done, but a lot of work done at home. But I think the common misperception is that, oh yeah, so-and-so works at home 2 days a week. So she's slacking or he's slacking off. We know. And now I think a lot of us will say, hey, wait, that isn't true. I worked at home and I found out that I was working a lot. So it's kind of given us all this slap in the face about what our misperceptions were. Now, it doesn't mean the performance doesn't need or can't or shouldn't be monitored. In fact, Mike, there's the other, I've talked a lot to small businesses lately because of some other work I do. And several of them who had stepped away from the business, you know, as owners, had said, as they should, you know, work on the business, not in the business. In these challenging economic times, they've said, look, I've come back onto the steering wheel or back on the reins. I'm taking more hands-on control. So when economic times are hard, often we want to make sure that we're not wasting anything, including people's time and energy, et cetera. So there's going to be this tendency to kind of hold things together. At the same time, to be able to understand that, well, holding things together performance-wise doesn't necessarily mean coming in here to the office where I can see you. The other thing is that some jobs do lend themselves more to managing from a distance if they have, you know, discrete outcomes and outputs can be measured clearly, and not every job has that. So that's another kind of challenge for organizations. But if you know what you're supposed to deliver and it's easy to measure, then it's much easier to say, well, do it wherever you want. And we might also see that third space being used differently too. Offices might downsize their corporate real estate profile and actually allow people to work in cafes more. I've often been amazed that given the culture of coffee in New Zealand and especially in Wellington, Auckland, Christchurch, that we don't have more work being done in these beautiful cafes, because overseas often, especially in college towns, you see whole businesses that run basically out of cafes, and people do a lot more work even in that cafe space. So again, the three triangles make sense, but who knows how we go from here.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for that, Darl. We're going to move to the Q&A session. See, the topmost question is from a Karen, and she asks, how do you think a blend of working from home and office impacts on a 4-day work week idea?
Well, I guess the thing that would probably work there is that if you saw 4 days still achieving, say, notionally 40 hours or something, so same amount of, well, actually, no, I guess the real principled 4-day work is that you do 4 days worth of hours or time and get paid for the full week, etc. So I suppose that it could do this. What you could do is say you're already going to have 3 days at home because we're not going to have 5 days of work. In those 4 days, you might say, and maybe less of those is done at home. So you might say one of those days is at home and 3 are required to be on campus or at the office. And when I say campus, again, having just recently been in Silicon Valley, this is their working spaces are called campuses too. Actually, again, from those environments that do have experimented with this, folks have told me, and my student at Facebook said he has meeting-free Wednesdays with his whole team. So they've come to this understanding that whether you work at home or not, you wouldn't have to physically show up because there won't be any face-to-face meetings on a Wednesday. And yet he said that's difficult not for himself to still come in or whatever. So part of it, again, is just managing where those boundaries are going to be. But for Karen's question, I think that the other way we need to think about work is, again, not time served. You know, being at a desk at 8:30 in the morning and facing all the traffic and all the hassles of life, what's purpose does that serve versus coming in more flexibly or staying home and getting more work done? Interestingly, the guy who helped me with my broadband connection was working from home in Pune, India. And while we were waiting for the routers to reboot and stuff, I asked him, how is it? He says, well, it's fine. They gave me a laptop, and he says, I don't have to commute. And of course, the traffic in Pune is quite significant. And he said, it's saving me a lot in terms of my life. And so I think if we start to factor that into what our work weeks are like, that would be useful.
Yeah, and to segue off that question onto another question by Denise, she says that in the first 6 weeks, there was a general perception by managers that working from home was actually very good, as we've just spoke about right now. And everyone's productivity was vastly improved for, you know, the reasons you mentioned as well, Darl. Yet there seems to be a sense now, and I touched on this as well, that returning to the office is the ideal, better for everyone and the employer. is there still an element of mistrust by employers about working from home? So I guess this is a direct parallel of the question I asked earlier as well.
Yeah, well, there is two things there. First of all, I've taught also organizational change. And one of the things we know is that in extraordinary circumstances, extraordinary things can happen. But to get real behavioral change over time, whether it's a technology change or a culture change, or in this case, a culture and technology change, is very difficult. And people snap back, if you will, to the original position or behaviors. So yeah, and in fact, again, if we were to study this, I would imagine in a year's time, if things remain equal in terms of the virus going away, a lot of workplaces will default back to the office model and justify it. Remember, as humans, we can make sense out of tea leaves as a species. So we will make sense of it in all kinds of ways, that we're supporting the CBD and poor real estate, landlords or whatever, or that we have to see each other for meetings or something. So, and I'm not poo-pooing those reasons. Some of them are real. But I would say the challenge is going forward, and just to have conversations in the workplace about this. A groundswell conversation might be a very powerful and useful thing for organizations to do. My sense is that a hybrid would be a reasonable outcome to say, well, we've learned that we'll be productive at home. Why not free it up to have 1 or 2 days at home? Why not loosen that up and then still battle traffic and come in the rest of the time or something? Yeah.
As a privilege, right?
As a privilege.
Yeah. And I guess related to that, looking at the other question now, is I guess the opposite of having our own sort of offices at home, for those of us fortunate enough to have our own space at home and work there. Is your research telling you anything about open plan offices?
Oh, well, that actually, it's not my specialty, but for those who do look at it, there's almost been universal rejection. I just read something recently that the cubicle, which was letting go of the door walled off office and going into spaces that were cubicles, were of course made fun of in Dilbert and everything. But the open plan, which is bean bags and completely open space, has also had a real pushback, because basically they're saying cubicles at least give you a little bit of personal space, a little bit of private, quiet time. It is interesting to see where we're going to go in that regard. And some of the experimentation around it has been, frankly, just following what seems to be a good idea in one industry or one sort of part of the world, and we don't know. But that's not to say that rethinking office space is not still useful, but the open plan is driving a lot of people crazy. And if you go to the campuses, again, that are full of highly motivated and super intelligent people, the setup at work doesn't make them any more productive one way or another. They're pretty focused. And so you just kind of need to get out of their way, but you don't want spaces that are too distracting and don't allow people to settle in. Yeah, we also know that if you give people a chance, they do want to go back to the same space. And again, we're creatures of habit and have those natural needs. And a lot of that disruptive stuff actually is not necessarily productive.
To take a different tack now, has your research revealed any insights in how Māori or other indigenous cultures have engaged in remote working?
Certainly not. I mean, this is an open and general study and approach, and so available widely and broad and generally. It's always occurred to me with some of my other connectivity work, the uptake of technology, the use of smartphones, for example. It's always been a question in the back of my mind. I've not been in a position to be able to focus on it, but it does again bear asking those questions. And for example, well, one example, and again, there's been quite a lot of research done on telemedicine. And I visited the University of Alaska on my last sabbatical. And because there you see a technology that reaches out into very remote areas and serves unique populations and distinct settings. And the questions, and again, we've seen it to be very effective. And once again, the COVID has amplified that prospect of having remote telemedicine. And that's not to say that Maori is just about telemedicine or remoteness, but it would be those kinds of questions I'd very much welcome, and maybe we'll get PhD students interested in that sort of question. Yeah.
Right. Paul asks, some people are more comfortable within silos and work effectively within them, while others are more willing to take the chance and reach across the organization for help. Is there any research about who those people are, the adventurers, and can anyone do it? What sort of prompts might ordinary staff need to be more adventurous?
Oh, wow. Adventurous. There's no psychological metric that I know of around that dimension. We do know about introversion and extroverts generally seek stimulation from a variety of stimuli. So they might talk to the person in another department, and that fires their brain a bit differently. But that's not to say introverts are the only ones who defend silos. To be honest, two things come to mind to improve cross-functional silos. One is psychological safety. And this is for all things, like innovation also is improved by this. Do I feel safe wandering down to the accounting department and asking a dumb question? Do I feel safe, challenging the marketing team on what we're doing? If there's psychological safety, you're more likely to sort of engage. And the other thing is simply middle managers, dare I say it, need to sort of be gatekeepers and control. You know, you have to come through me to talk to accounting, or you have to come through me to talk to the marketing group. So if middle managers sort of give the idea that they're controlling the agenda, then that does dampen down any cross-functional sort of interaction. But it might also be going back to the open space. Maybe the metaphoric open space is saying, well, why don't we actually get more cross-functional teaming going? And that would be helpful to the organization.
Great. And going back to this idea of metaphor, this next question is probably a little bit more personal, but interesting nonetheless. To what extent is the background you have chosen a metaphor for your talk?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, I opted, this is my home. Yeah, it's a metaphor in the sense that my home office brings together kind of elements of my my life that are important. So this is an earth brick home that we built. It's not that we're total eco warriors, but it is an eco house, and it's in a lovely outdoor setting. So it brings those wilderness days into my current life. And I suppose that it's funny because in study, but I do take some comfort in the having things that are of me around me. So, and maybe others in the audience would be feeling the same, that there are things on their shelves. And I remember one talk before this that what you do see in frame in the presentations is, one time I met this guy, and he's a very sharp colleague, but I didn't know him that well, and we did a Zoom or a Skype call. And on his shelf were all these amazing models of, I forget even what they were, but that collection of models just said something about him that was really terrific. And I don't know if it was metaphoric, but it certainly was another dimension of himself that he brought in. And I suppose that's something we didn't ask about, but I think there is this notion of, maybe it's false too, that we're more our total selves at home. But to some extent, most of us would feel that there are at least other elements of ourselves. And because work has come into home, think of it that way, work colleagues show up in our home, then we're sharing more of that out. And yeah, so hopefully they don't mind the background. Someone asked me recently, they knew I was on sabbatical, they wondered what part of the world I was in, but I am in New Zealand.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny you should say that, because I guess there could be a whole study done on what type of virtual backgrounds people have been picking, right, to sort of perform their workplace roles. I've got the call to wrap it up, so I've got one more question. Unfortunately, there's some other questions here which I understand can be address that on the actual website later. But for the final audience question, what suggestions do you have to help staff separate work from home when located at home?
Well, I think, again, maybe I'll just use personal examples, but well, this goes also with what I've learned about connectivity in general. So one thing is to simply vary, get up and walk around. So if there is just, again, the risk of sitting too much screen time. And one of the simple ways to deal with that from a health point of view is to simply move and change what you're doing. And this is easier said than done. I mean, I myself pretty active and have lots of space to go to, but I find that with my wife reminds me how long I can sit just by being focused on work. And so that's one thing, is to try to build in routines that break that up. I think also, to the extent that's possible, again, other kinds of mental activity and not just screen time, and not that there's anything wrong with watching lots of TV, but maybe to say, well, if I'm spending work time on screen, maybe I'll do another kind of hobby that's physical, or maybe just a different kind of thinking. And the other, now that we're out of lockdown, is to do social interactions that, again, get our other parts of our mind engaged and just give us the kind of, again, that coffee break, that drink with someone, or that talk over the fence, to be able to sort of keep that element going.
So once again, I'd like to thank Darl for his insights and time. So for those in the audience, remember to check out his project website, metaphorsinuse.com. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, and our alumni for your interest. Raising the Bar Home Edition is a series of 6 speakers over 6 weeks. Darl was webinar 4 of the series. There are 2 more left. So please check the link on the closing slide if you'd like to join us at another talk. Thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.